What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively turning insights into permanent systems, the way that I'm actively thinking about this, and also how I plan on scaling this into the future. So like always with these videos, the main mission, I am not going to go through the long story. The main mission of these videos is to use this as a thinking OS to refine our thinking, how we're actively strategizing and implementing different mental models and frameworks inside Killer Chaos OS, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So I think this is a super powerful, way to think about insights, because insights are ultimately, for me, the way I see them, are data points, and through these data points you can ultimately, build something that also relies on feedback and saying, hey, we're actively turning every insight and making sure that this insight is as valuable as the system it feeds, making sure that knowledge without structure is ultimately noise. And how do we actively, safeguard or create these structure methods in terms of how we're actively synthesizing knowledge and also implementing it into, Killer Chaos OS as well, and saying, hey, this is the way that I'm thinking about it for Chaos Killer OS and in my own workflow. So these are two separate things, my personal life and also for the vision of Killer Chaos OS, or Chaos Killer OS, whichever one you like to say it. But number one is ultimately, capturing everything, because I think each and every, starting point starts from, being able to capture all the data points, which are, ideas, patterns, lessons from failures as well, saying, hey, each and every single idea that I have, I'm ultimately gonna log it, because you simply just don't know if it's gonna be the thing that you're, gonna be able to connect the patterns with into the future, because these patterns as well, which also feed from ideas, you can ultimately run them. Like, there are certain things that I found myself, that I've written 5 years ago, that looking now, 5 years later, I'm like, oh, this could actually, be implemented in terms of what it is that we're building today, in terms of just thinking about systems, and ultimately saying, hey, like, what if the insight or the idea that I had, if I did not write it down or log it 5 years ago, we wouldn't be able to think, about building Chaos Killer OS in this certain way. And I think, there obviously are going to be so many ideas that are going to, go to quote unquote waste, but I think there are going to be a few nuggets, at least I found in my personal experience, that, there are going to be few nuggets in terms of ideas that you can ultimately run with, 5 years later on, which are ultimately gonna, move the needle for you in many different ways. And also recognizing patterns, because I think, being able to capture each and every, idea, thought, or even just lessons from failure ultimately allows you to, to recognize patterns that are within, what it is that you're doing throughout your life journey. Because I remember watching one Stanford business video that said that you're the only one version of yourself, and through that one version of yourself, you have a unique set of experiences, you have a unique worldview in terms of how you, have gone through, your time from being born till today. And ultimately through that, if you just log each and every single decision that you've made, and also the, the steps you've taken and the failures that you have made and the lessons you've learned from that, I think, you're able to create a product that is, unique to you as well, that you can ultimately, use to create value into the future. And this is why I think each and every single insight is ultimately a data point, and through, really analyzing that and also recognizing the patterns using pattern recognition, you can ultimately find, the different insights that link up to each other, and ultimately through that you can build a product or a software or whatever it is that you're actively building, and you can ultimately create value through that. And I think for me, one of the biggest things, is ultimately just come from journaling. I think journaling each and every single day is ultimately a game changer, because you're able to, just write what it is that you're actively thinking about in the present moment, what you've learned as well, and use that to basically, perfect this thinking OS model of yourself. Because I think each and every single thing that, I'm building in this present moment in time is ultimately refining the way that I think about solutions, the way that I'm actively solving for problems as well. Because each and every, way that that out, or each and every manner that I write, different ideas, different concepts, is ultimately refining my thinking. And I think, for me, the main mission for Chaos Killer OS into the future is going to be how we're going to be thinking through mental models, frameworks, and how we're going to be scaling those into the future. And I think that comes from a lot of reflection and also, just clarity as well. Because through that clarity, you're going to form breakthroughs, at least from what I found, just having a pen and a piece of paper and just writing all the thoughts, ideas that you're actively having. And I think, you recognize patterns through that. And that's where pattern recognition comes in, because you're able to see patterns in your way of thinking, and you're actively able to refine your thinking on a day-to-day basis by actively just journaling. I have 3 journals that I have right now that I've actively just filled up, just to, I don't know where the third one is. I think this is the third one. These 3 journals that I've actively just filled in, and just ultimately each and every single day I say I'm gonna be able to create this this thinking OS within my internal framework that will ultimately transfer into the things that I am building on a day-to-day basis, whether it's different automation stacks, thinking through different tech stacks as well that we're going to be integrating and implementing. I think just having this mode where you're ultimately in a space of just constantly refining your thinking through just writing as well. I mean, it's separate for everyone else, but for me it's writing and reading, because you ultimately form these feedback loops that ultimately allow you to see patterns that you may have not recognized before. And through that, you need to also be able to distill and and abstract, which ultimately means that you need to be able to identify the underlying principle behind each insight. Because I think in as much as you can recognize patterns and you can see different things throughout your life, you ultimately need to also understand what is the underlying principle that is governing what this insight is telling you, saying, hey, like, you could ultimately be you could ultimately in your journey be experiencing a lot of adversity. Then you could ask, okay, so what's the one rule here that I'm learning, and how can I apply this beyond one instance? So if you face a lot of adversity throughout your life, you could say, hey, what if the governing principle that this adversity is trying to teach me is ultimately resilience, and through this resilience it's ultimately going to get me to the place that I need to get to, because the vision that I have internally is so big that I'm going to have to build this resilience within myself. And how does that resilience gets built? The world basically hands it to you, and if you are able to face that, that means whatever comes your way, you're able to face it head on and without fail or fear, and you're just able to understand that, hey, this principle is ultimately guiding how you're going to be building into the future. And it's showing you that, hey, throughout your life you've had to deal with these different setbacks, but you as a person are able to just overcome them, because your vision is greater, and it's ultimately molding you and preparing you to say, hey, if you're actively wanting this big picture vision for yourself, you have to go through XYZ. And you could say, hey, for in terms of your ideas, what if you constantly have the idea of starting a coffee business, and you ultimately start it, and then it ultimately becomes a success, but then you realize later on that, hey, this this idea or these patterns or different things that you were journaling and writing about on a day-to-day basis wasn't because you were obsessed about making coffee, but you were obsessed with the value chain cycle of actually creating coffee. And then you decide, hey, what if making selling coffee wasn't the actual mode that you ultimately was striving for, but then you realize that the underlying principle here was ultimately that you wanted to create value. And how did you find the vehicle that you were to create value? You found it through coffee, and then you ultimately become this person that is obsessed about the value creation cycle through creating coffee. And then you say, hey, what if what I need to do is not the actual selling of the coffee, but the actual production, the value chain cycle that goes into understanding how to make coffee, the different roasting methods, the different harvesting periods, and all these different things. And what if you realize that, hey, the governing principle was that, hey, you're deeply obsessed about the value creation cycle of coffee, so you ultimately need to go and chase that specific value creation cycle through that, because that's where you can create the most amount of value. And through this, you need to also be able to systemize. So for example, saying, hey, you need to be able to turn these repeatable lessons into templates, automations, or processes. What I mean by templates is ultimately saying, hey, you have faced XYZ in your life. How can you use this as a template to fix or to go through different other instances within your personal journey, or even processes and automations to say, hey, we have this specific, automation that runs how we're actively doing outreach. Okay, how do we turn this into a repeatable step? For example, just like I said, now by turning it into, automations, that ultimately allow you to scale your processes on a day-to-day basis. And also processes, you can also just see this through different processes that you may have within your own life. Let's say, hey, for example, you wake up each and every single morning and you say, I have coffee first, and then I go on my phone, then I read up on some news, and I do this email. Ultimately, that is the most optimal, way that you see that your brain needs to wake up super early rather than staying up late, and that gets you into your optimal efficiency, that gets you to, producing at a high velocity and makes you a high urgent agency person as well, because you ultimately just need to be able to turn these different instances into templates that are repeatable, because ultimately through that you ultimately going to be able to scale your output, at least from the way that I've seen it. And an example of this, another example that you can think about is a lead response pattern becomes a predictive alert in terms of Chaos Killer OS, saying, hey, we're actively seeing that this lead response pattern is ultimately forming the way that we are able to recognize the pattern, say, hey, leads are responding in XYZ manner periodically, saying, hey, each and every time between 9 to 10 a.m. they're ultimately responding, and that ultimately becomes a predictive analysis tool that we're going to be using within Chaos Killer OS, which we're ultimately going to scale. But through that, we also need to be able to test and then iterate on that to say, hey, systems aren't static, systems are dynamic. And I think many things that we experience in this life are dynamic, especially when it comes to systems. Almost all of them are super dynamic, because there are a lot of interchanging and moving parts as well, saying, hey, XYZ, if A influences B, there's somehow a manner in which B also influences A. So if, for example, you could also say that, hey, if rich people, or quote unquote high net worth individuals cause poverty, then there somehow is a way in or a manner in which poverty also causes these high net worth individuals. It's just an example of just ultimately thinking in terms of systems that, hey, if A influences B, then B somehow should be able to influence A in some degree or form factor. And ultimately understanding that, hey, this ultimately means that systems are dynamic, flows are also as dynamic as well, because you're able to then iterate on each of them, which ultimately you can refine. So saying, hey, each and every system and process is dynamic, and we need to understand all the different moving parts and how they could possibly influence each other, and through that we can basically test and then iterate on that. And saying, hey, feedback loops are also super important, because I think feedback loops can be right and can be wrong. There's no such thing as good or bad feedback, in my opinion. I think feedback is the most that ultimately allows you to gather the data points and take a decision that is backed by those data points, because if you're able to form these data points, you can then make an informed decision to say, hey, if we're actively building XYZ in this manner, then we're going to stop and then ultimately scale it in another manner, because the data is telling us otherwise. Because if you don't have those data points, I think you're just shooting in blind, and that is one of the worst things that you could possibly do, just shooting in blind in terms of building MVPs or just doing certain things that you're doing inside the business and also in your personal life. I think testing cheaply, which I spoke about, I'm not sure if it was last video or the video before that, when I was saying, hey, You need to be able to, test cheaply in terms of rolling out MVPs, just ultimately being able to, spend cheaply and figuring out does XYZ work. And then if it works and you've gathered those data points, then you run with it. You pump a lot more into it. Then you ultimately are able to use these feedback cycles as, the moat that ultimately drives the picture perfect vision of Chaos Killer OS, which is a refinement process. This refinement process never ends. I think for me, it's all about, just being a lifelong learner and always just staying in the game longer and just learning each and every single day, because through this you're able to refine your processes and the manner in which you're able to think, which leads to, these small improvements in the process or decision making that ultimately accelerates the scale without more input. Because I think, each and every single thing that you think is perfect, you can ultimately refine it, because we're in this age or this period of time where there's so many things that, we think or we may see that are perfect, but ultimately realizing that, hey, there's no such thing as a, 100% safe, secure system. So why would that mean that there's 100% perfect product or service that's going to come to the floor? And ultimately, having that mindset and adapting to that mindset as well of always being a lifelong learner to say, hey, how can we actively just improve and iterate on what it is that we're building today, so that tomorrow we're also, are well equipped to handle the challenges that may come our way. Because I think, this leverage that ultimately compounds through this, because, every insight converts into a system that compounds over time. Because I think, one of the most important things is ultimately just focusing, on creating this compounding leverage, and this compounding leverage that you're building on a day-to-day basis ultimately comes from the small daily actions that you're taking on a day-to-day basis. And through this, you ultimately are able to form these feedback loops and tie it as well to the compounding leverage, which means that each and every single day you're shifting this, this mindset towards a never ending but also, compounding leverage, mindset, to say, hey, how can we actively test and iterate based on feedback loops, and also use this in the form factor, and also consider using and incorporating, compounding leverage to say, hey, we're using this feedback in a manner that will, ultimately guide us and will be the compounding leverage that will ultimately build the next generation of backend systems, which is ultimately going to be super important. Because I think when you're striving for a very big goal, you ultimately just need to constantly adapt and also just refine the processes, which ultimately scales your thinking as well in terms of how, we're actively using insights in terms of, turning these into permanent systems, because through these insights we're able to just build it once and then use it again into the future, and then only just focus on refining it. And through that, you ultimately are able to build this big picture vision of what it is that you're striving for, in our case, which is Killer Chaos OS. And through this, it ultimately gives me the, the main takeaways from this that I like for you guys to have, and that I, always have, which is, insights are fuel, but systems are the engines. So basically to say, these insights are ultimately the fuel that, we pump into this engine, and this engine are the systems that we are able to then, build and then ultimately just pump more fuel, because with fuel we're able to drive and have that endurance that gets us to the next level, and also allows us to continuously push through, those difficult times as well. Because, Killer Chaos OS ultimately isn't just a product, it's a living framework where every lesson is captured, refined, and built into the future. So basically asking each and every single day, how can we actively, use these lessons that we're actively learning on a day-to-day basis in order to refine our thinking, and also use this to build into the future. I know we're going to get it wrong so many times, but ultimately just taking these small, daily actions on a day-to-day basis by incorporating, insights, I think we're going to end in a place where we're going to refine the machine as much as possible, and we're going to be these lifelong learners that understand that systems are dynamics, but all are dynamic, but ultimately through this we're going to gather all the insights that we need in order to build these permanent systems that ultimately allows us to scale the impact and also redefine industries, like I always speak about, to say, hey, we're actively going to build it in XYZ manner, but through this we're going to move one step closer to the main vision of Chaos Killer OS. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.